What happens when the world's most watched couple steps away from the cameras, removes their royal titles for just one evening, and becomes simply William and Catherine? As midnight approached on December 31st, while millions celebrated across Britain, the Prince and Princess of Wales made a choice that surprised even their closest staff. Instead of attending the grand royal festivities at Windsor Castle or hosting their own formal gathering at Kensington Palace, they packed their children into a modest car and drove through the quiet countryside to a small cottage in Bucklebury, Berkshire. This is the story of how two people, burdened with the weight of a nation's expectations, found something they rarely experience: the simple joy of being part of an ordinary family. It's about laughter that echoes through farmhouse kitchens instead of palace halls, about children playing hide-and-seek in gardens rather than attending state functions, and about a couple who, for one precious night, remembered what it felt like to just be themselves. What unfolded over those winter days would remind them why family matters more than protocol, why genuine moments are worth more than perfect photographs, and why sometimes the most important conversations happen not in boardrooms or throne rooms, but around a kitchen table with people who knew them before they were headlines. This is their story, real, unguarded, and beautifully human. The morning of December 30th arrived with an unusual quietness at Adelaide Cottage. Catherine stood at the kitchen window, watching frost crystals form delicate patterns on the glass while steam rose from her coffee mug. The children were still asleep upstairs, and William had gone for an early morning run around the grounds. For the first time in weeks, she had a moment to think without the constant buzz of royal duties demanding her attention. Her phone buzzed on the marble countertop. A text from her mother: "Carol, still expecting you all tomorrow? The cottage feels too quiet without grandchildren's laughter." Catherine smiled, remembering how George had declared last Christmas that Granny Carol made the best hot chocolate in the entire world, even better than the palace chefs. The original plan had been different. The New Year's Eve state reception at Windsor Castle loomed in her calendar, complete with visiting dignitaries, formal speeches, and the kind of carefully orchestrated celebration that looked magnificent in photographs but felt hollow in reality. William would wear his ceremonial uniform, she would don a tiara and smile for exactly 4 hours and 23 minutes, and they would represent the monarchy with the perfect grace expected of them. But, as she stood there in her simple pajamas, watching the ordinary morning unfold, Catherine felt something shift inside her. When had she last seen William truly laugh? Not the polite chuckle he offered during official engagements, but the deep, genuine laughter that had first attracted her to him during their university days? When had she last seen her children simply be children, without photographers documenting their every move or protocol officers reminding them of proper behavior? The kitchen door opened, and William entered, cheeks flushed from the cold morning air. He pulled off his running gloves and moved toward the coffee machine with the comfortable familiarity of a man in his own home. "You're up early," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "I was thinking," Catherine said, leaning back into his warmth. "Dangerous territory," William teased, but his tone was gentle. Catherine turned in his arms to face him. "What if we didn't go to Windsor tomorrow?" William's eyebrows raised slightly. "The reception? Catherine, we can't just— what if we spent New Year's Eve with my family instead? Really spend it with them, not just a quick visit between official duties. What if we actually celebrated like normal people for once?" The suggestion hung in the air between them. William was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine could see him weighing the implications. The disappointment of the palace staff who had spent months organizing the reception. The questions from the press about their absence. The delicate balance of royal duty versus personal choice that governed every aspect of their lives. "The children have been asking if they could sleep over at Granny and Grandpa's house," Catherine continued softly. "George wants to help Grandpa with his beehives, and Charlotte has been planning to teach Granny how to make friendship bracelets." When was the last time they had that? Just being grandchildren? William moved to the window, looking out at the same frost patterns that had captured Catherine's attention. "My grandmother always said that duty comes first," he said quietly. "She also said that family was the most important thing in the world," Catherine replied. "She understood better than anyone what we sacrifice for this role." The sound of small feet on the stairs interrupted their conversation. George appeared in the doorway, his hair sticking up in every direction, followed closely by Charlotte in her favorite princess nightgown and Louis clutching his stuffed dog. "Mummy, can we have pancakes?" Charlotte asked, climbing onto a kitchen stool. "Are we really going to Granny Carol's tomorrow?" George added hopefully. William and Catherine exchanged glances. In that moment, looking at their children's expectant faces, the decision felt easier than it should have. "Would you like to spend New Year's Eve there?" Catherine asked carefully. Yes, all three children chorused, and Louis began jumping up and down with excitement. "Can we stay up until midnight?" George asked. "Can we make party hats?" Charlotte added. "Can Uncle James tell us stories?" Louis chimed in. William watched his children's faces light up with genuine excitement about something as simple as a family gathering. No cameras, no formal clothes, no reminders about royal protocol. Just children looking forward to time with their grandparents. "Let me make some calls," William said quietly to Catherine. The next few hours were a delicate dance of diplomatic conversations. William spoke with his father's office, explaining that a minor scheduling conflict had arisen. Catherine coordinated with their protection officers about security arrangements for an informal family visit. Their private secretary, initially shocked by the change in plans, gradually warmed to the idea when William explained their desire for a more personal celebration. "Sir, the press will certainly notice your absence from the Windsor reception," their communications director warned during a conference call. "Then, we'll give them something else to write about," William replied. "A story about a family choosing to spend the new year together." "Isn't that what most of our subjects are doing tomorrow night?" The afternoon was spent packing, but not in the usual royal fashion. Instead of formal luggage carefully organized by valets, the family threw comfortable clothes into weekend bags. Catherine included the children's favorite bedtime stories, their special blankets, and a selection of board games. William packed his camera, not for official photographs, but to capture genuine moments. As they prepared to leave Adelaide Cottage, Catherine felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in months. Charlotte had insisted on wearing her Christmas reindeer sweater, George had packed his collection of Pokémon cards to show Grandpa Michael, and Louis had demanded to bring 3 stuffed animals for what he called a sleepover adventure. "Are you sure about this?" William asked as they loaded the car. Catherine looked at their children, chattering excitedly in the back seat about all the things they wanted to do at their grandparents' house. "I've never been more sure of anything." The drive to Bucklebury took them through winding country roads lined with bare winter trees. As they left the formal grounds of their royal residence behind, Catherine felt as though they were shedding their public personas with each mile. In the rearview mirror, she could see the children playing I Spy with their protection officer, who had gamely agreed to participate in their games. "Remember our first New Year's Eve together?" William asked as they drove through a small village where lights twinkled in cottage windows. Catherine smiled at the memory. "Your tiny flat at RAF Valley. We had Chinese takeaway and watched fireworks on television because it was too cold to go outside." "Best New Year's Eve I'd ever had," William said. "Because it was real," Catherine replied softly. As they turned into the familiar driveway of the Middleton family home, Catherine felt a sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with childhood nostalgia and everything to do with the promise of authenticity. Here, William wasn't a future king and she wasn't a princess. They were simply Kate and William, coming home for the holidays with their children. Carol Middleton appeared at the front door before they had even parked, followed by Michael and James. The children scrambled out of the car and ran toward their grandparents, who caught them in enthusiastic embraces. Catherine watched William's shoulders relax as he was greeted not with bows and formal addresses, but with warm hugs and genuine smiles. "Welcome home," Carol said, embracing her daughter tightly. As they walked toward the cottage, Catherine realized that this was exactly what they needed. Not a grand celebration witnessed by hundreds of dignitaries, but a simple evening with people who loved them not for their titles, but for who they were underneath all the ceremony and protocol. The adventure was just beginning, and already Catherine knew they had made the right choice. The Middleton family cottage felt wonderfully chaotic compared to the controlled environment of royal residences. Within minutes of their arrival, Louis had discovered a collection of wooden toys that James had played with as a child, Charlotte was helping her grandmother arrange flowers picked from the winter garden, and George was deep in conversation with his grandfather about the proper way to maintain beehives during cold weather. Catherine stood in the familiar kitchen, breathing in the scent of cinnamon and baking bread that had defined her childhood. Her mother moved around the space with practiced efficiency, preparing tea and arranging homemade biscuits on a plate that had been in the family for generations. It was such a contrast to the formal silver service they were accustomed to that Catherine found herself marveling at the simple pleasure of watching her mother work. "You look tired, darling," Carol observed, glancing at her daughter with the concerned eye that only mothers possess. "Just busy," Catherine replied, but she knew her mother could see through the diplomatic answer. "When was the last time you had a proper break? Not a royal tour or an official engagement, but actual time to rest?" Catherine paused, trying to remember. The past year had been a blur of carefully scheduled appearances, state functions, and charitable commitments. Even their family holidays were documented and analyzed by the press. She couldn't recall the last time she had simply sat without agenda or purpose. "I can't remember," she admitted softly. Carol set down her tea towel and pulled her daughter into a gentle hug. "Then, this weekend is exactly what you need." Through the kitchen window, Catherine could see William and her father examining the garden shed, engaged in what appeared to be a serious discussion about Michael's latest woodworking project. William had changed from his formal traveling clothes into jeans and a woolly jumper, and the transformation was remarkable. His shoulders had lost their rigid royal posture, and he was laughing at something Michael had said with the kind of unguarded enthusiasm Catherine rarely witnessed anymore. James appeared in the kitchen doorway, carrying Louis piggyback style while the little boy giggled delightedly. "And Catherine, Louis wants to know if Uncle James can sleep in his room tonight so they can have what he calls boy talks." "Boy talks are very important," Catherine agreed solemnly, earning an approving nod from Louis. "We're going to discuss dinosaurs and space rockets," James explained with equal seriousness. "It's sophisticated conversation." The afternoon unfolded with the kind of gentle unpredictability that Catherine had forgotten was possible. There were no scheduled activities or carefully timed events. Instead, the family moved naturally from one moment to the next. Charlotte discovered a box of old dress-up clothes in the attic and convinced everyone to participate in an impromptu fashion show. George and his grandfather spent an hour building an elaborate fort out of cushions and blankets in the sitting room. William found himself drawn into a complex game of hide-and-seek that involved every room of the cottage and resulted in him being discovered crammed into a closet, much to the children's delight. As evening approached, the family gathered in the kitchen to prepare dinner together. This was another revelation for Catherine, the collaborative nature of the meal preparation, so different from their usual experience of having perfectly prepared courses served by staff. Here, everyone had a role. Charlotte was carefully washing vegetables under her grandmother's supervision, George was helping his grandfather prepare a marinade for the chicken, and Louis was arranging napkins with the intense concentration of someone entrusted with an important job. William found himself peeling potatoes alongside James, engaged in the kind of casual conversation that never happened during official events. They talked about everything and nothing: James's recent photography exhibition, William's thoughts on conservation efforts, shared memories of university days, and the simple pleasure of working with their hands. "You know," James said as they worked, "I've never seen you look this relaxed." William paused in his peeling to consider this. "I feel like I can breathe here," he admitted. "Like I can just be myself without worrying about protocol or cameras or whether every word I say will be analyzed in tomorrow's headlines." "That must be exhausting," James observed. "It is," William replied quietly. "More than I realized." Dinner was served at the large farmhouse table that had been the heart of Catherine's childhood home. There were no place cards or formal seating arrangements. Instead, people sat where they felt comfortable, children mixed in with adults, conversation flowing naturally from topic to topic. The food was simple but delicious: roasted chicken with herbs from the garden, perfectly golden potatoes, fresh vegetables, and homemade bread that filled the house with warmth. Catherine watched her children throughout the meal, noticing how different they seemed in this environment. Without the constant awareness of being observed and photographed, they were more animated, more genuinely themselves. George told elaborate stories about his school friends, complete with voices and gestures. Charlotte sang a song she had learned in music class, her clear voice filling the room with joy. Louis attempted to explain a complex theory about why dinosaurs would have made good pets, his logic both hilarious and oddly convincing. "Granny," Charlotte said during a pause in the conversation, "can you teach me how to make your special cookies tomorrow? The ones with the jam in the middle?" "Of course, darling," Carol replied. "We'll make enough for everyone to take home. Will you write down the recipe so Mummy can make them at our house?" Charlotte asked. Catherine felt a pang of longing at her daughter's innocent assumption that she would have time to bake cookies with her children. When was the last time they had spent an afternoon in their own kitchen, making memories rather than appearing at events? "I'd like that very much," Catherine said, and meant it. After dinner, the family moved to the sitting room, where a fire crackled warmly in the hearth. There was no television schedule to follow or entertainment to be provided. Instead, they simply enjoyed each other's company. Michael pulled out an old guitar and played songs that had Catherine and James singing along to melodies from their childhood. William joined in when he knew the words, his voice blending harmoniously with the others. Louis fell asleep in his father's arms during a particularly gentle lullaby, his small body completely relaxed in the way that only completely secure children can manage. Charlotte curled up next to her grandmother, listening to stories about Catherine's childhood adventures. George sat by the fire with his grandfather, learning to play chess and asking thoughtful questions about strategy and patience. As the evening grew late, Catherine found herself sitting beside William on an old sofa that had been in her parents' home for as long as she could remember. The formal distance they usually maintained in public settings had melted away, and she tucked her feet under her as she leaned against his shoulder. "This is nice," William said quietly, his voice heavy with contentment. "Different from what we usually do on New Year's Eve," Catherine replied. "Better," William said without hesitation. Around them, the quiet conversations of family life continued. Carol and Michael were discussing plans for the next day's activities, while James was showing George photographs from his recent travels. The cottage felt full of life and warmth, a stark contrast to the grand but often empty rooms they inhabited in their official lives. "Do you think we could do this more often?" Catherine asked softly. William was quiet for a moment, considering the question and all its implications. "I'd like to try," he said finally. "I'd like the children to have more of this." As the evening wound down and everyone began preparing for bed, Catherine felt a sense of peace that had been absent from her life for longer than she cared to admit. Here, surrounded by people who loved them unconditionally, the weight of royal responsibility felt manageable, less overwhelming. The children went to bed in rooms that smelled like lavender and held memories of countless family visits. Catherine tucked them in with stories and kisses, promising adventures for tomorrow while secretly hoping this feeling of normalcy could last just a little longer. Tomorrow would bring new experiences and deeper connections, but tonight, as she and William settled into the guest room that had once been her childhood bedroom, Catherine felt grateful for the simple pleasure of being exactly where they belonged. New Year's Eve morning dawned crisp and bright, with frost covering the cottage garden like a delicate lace tablecloth. Catherine woke to the unfamiliar sound of complete quiet, no staff moving about, no official schedules waiting, no phones buzzing with urgent messages. For the first time in months, she had nowhere to be except exactly where she was. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee drifted up from the kitchen, along with the sound of muffled laughter. Catherine smiled, recognizing Louis's distinctive giggle mixed with her father's deeper chuckles. She found William already awake, propped up on one elbow and watching her with an expression she hadn't seen in far too long, completely relaxed and content. "Good morning," he said softly, mindful that the cottage walls were thinner than the palace ones they were accustomed to. "Good morning," Catherine replied, stretching luxuriously. "What time is it?" William glanced at his watch. "Nearly 9. When was the last time we slept until 9? Catherine tried to remember and couldn't. Their official duties typically began early, with briefings and preparation sessions that started long before most people began their workday. Sleeping until 9 felt deliciously indulgent. They made their way downstairs to find the kitchen already bustling with activity. Louis was standing on a step stool beside his grandfather, carefully turning strips of bacon under Michael's watchful guidance. His small face was serious with concentration, and he wore one of Carol's aprons tied multiple times around his waist. "Mummy! Daddy!" Louis called out when he spotted them. "I'm making breakfast. Grandpa says I'm an excellent cook." "The best assistant I've ever had," Michael confirmed, ruffling his grandson's hair. Charlotte was at the kitchen table with Carol, carefully measuring ingredients into a large mixing bowl. Flour dusted her cheeks, and she wore an expression of intense focus as she followed her grandmother's instructions for making pancakes from scratch. "These are going to be the best pancakes ever," Charlotte announced confidently. "Granny says the secret is not to overmix the batter." George was curled up in the window seat with one of James's old adventure books, occasionally looking up to watch the family activity around him. The morning light caught his profile, and Catherine was struck by how much older he seemed when he was allowed to simply exist without the constant awareness of being watched and photographed. "James is still asleep," Carol explained, handing Catherine a steaming mug of coffee. "I told him he's getting too old to stay up reading until all hours, but he claimed he was researching photography techniques for his next exhibition." "More likely he was reading comic books," Catherine laughed, remembering her brother's childhood habits. The morning unfolded with the same gentle rhythm that had characterized their arrival. Breakfast was a cheerful chaos of homemade pancakes, crispy bacon, fresh fruit, and conversation that jumped from topic to topic without any formal structure. Louis proudly presented his bacon cooking efforts, which were indeed perfectly crisp. Charlotte's pancakes were fluffy and delicious, and she beamed with pride when everyone praised her culinary skills. After breakfast, the family decided to take advantage of the bright winter day with a walk through the countryside surrounding the cottage. This required some coordination with their protection officers, but Catherine was pleased to note how seamlessly the security arrangements were handled. The officers maintained their professional distance while allowing the family to feel free and unobserved. The walk took them along familiar paths that Catherine had explored countless times during her childhood. She pointed out landmarks to her children: the old oak tree where she and James used to build treehouses, the stream where they caught tadpoles in the spring, the hill where they flew kites on windy days. William walked alongside, listening to these stories of a childhood so different from his own, marked by freedom and simplicity rather than protocol and duty. "Did you really climb to the very top of that tree?" George asked, staring up at the massive oak with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "Right to the very top," Catherine confirmed. "Your Uncle James dared me, and I was determined to prove I could do anything he could do." "Were you scared?" Charlotte asked. "Terrified," Catherine admitted. "But sometimes the best adventures happen when you're a little bit scared." Louis had been picked up by James, who had finally emerged from his morning slumber and joined their walk. The little boy was chattering constantly, pointing out interesting rocks and asking elaborate questions about the wildlife they might encounter. His enthusiasm was infectious, and soon the whole group was searching for signs of rabbits, birds, and other woodland creatures. William found himself walking beside Michael, engaged in the kind of unhurried conversation that never seemed possible in their official lives. They discussed everything from gardening to politics to parenthood, and William was struck by how much he enjoyed simply talking with someone who had no agenda other than genuine interest in the conversation. "Catherine was always the adventurous one," Michael was saying, watching his daughter point out various landmarks to her children. "James was more cautious, more likely to think things through before acting. But Catherine would charge ahead and figure out the details later." "She still does that," William said fondly. "It served her well, I think," Michael observed. "Royal life requires someone willing to take risks, to step into unknown situations with confidence." William nodded, thinking about how Catherine had approached every aspect of their royal duties with the same spirit of adventure she had shown as a child. Whether meeting world leaders or visiting hospitals, she brought an authenticity and warmth that couldn't be taught or manufactured. The walk lasted nearly 2 hours, with frequent stops to examine interesting discoveries or to let Louis rest his small legs. By the time they returned to the cottage, everyone was rosy-cheeked from the cold air and ready for the warm comfort of home. The afternoon was dedicated to New Year's Eve preparations, but these bore no resemblance to the formal planning that usually accompanied their holiday celebrations. Instead, the family worked together to transform the cottage into a festive party venue using creativity and enthusiasm rather than professional decorators and expensive materials. Charlotte and Carol spent time in the craft room, making party hats from colorful paper and decorating them with glitter and ribbons. Their creations were wonderfully imperfect, lopsided and glittery and absolutely perfect for their purposes. George and Michael worked on creating a countdown clock from cardboard, complete with movable hands that could track their progress toward midnight. Louis bounced between various activities, offering enthusiastic but not always helpful assistance to everyone's projects. William discovered a talent for making paper streamers, carefully cutting long strips of tissue paper and showing Charlotte how to create loops and chains for decorating. The work was meditative, requiring just enough concentration to quiet his usually busy mind while allowing him to enjoy the cheerful chaos around him. James emerged from his room with a collection of photography equipment, announcing his intention to document their informal celebration. Unlike the official photographers who usually captured their events, James worked quietly and unobtrusively, catching candid moments rather than posed portraits. His camera captured Louis's intense concentration as he arranged napkins for their evening meal, Charlotte's proud smile as she modeled her completed party hat, George's thoughtful expression as he helped his grandfather with their countdown clock project. As afternoon faded into evening, the cottage felt magical in its simplicity. Homemade decorations hung from every available surface, the kitchen smelled of Carol's famous party snacks, and excitement buzzed in the air. This was celebration in its purest form, people who loved each other preparing to mark an important moment together. Catherine stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her family work together with such natural harmony. William was helping Louis hang streamers at a height the little boy could reach, George was carefully testing their homemade noisemakers, and Charlotte was putting finishing touches on placecards she had created for their evening meal. Her parents and James moved through the space with practiced efficiency, years of family celebrations having taught them exactly how to work together. For the first time in years, Catherine felt completely present in the moment. There were no photographers to smile for, no schedule to maintain, no official requirements to fulfill. There was only this, her family, her children, and the simple pleasure of preparing to welcome a new year together. The evening promised to be everything their usual formal celebrations were not: intimate, genuine, and filled with the kind of joy that couldn't be orchestrated or performed. As the sun set over the Berkshire countryside, Catherine knew that this New Year's Eve would be one they would remember not for its grandeur, but for its authenticity. 3 As evening descended on the cottage, the atmosphere transformed into something magical. The homemade decorations caught the warm light from table lamps and candles, creating a cozy glow that no professional lighting designer could have improved upon. The family had decided to make their New Year's Eve celebration a progressive affair, starting with games in the sitting room, followed by a special dinner, and culminating in their own private countdown to midnight. The sitting room had been transformed into a party venue that rivaled any royal ballroom in terms of joy, if not in grandeur. Charlotte's glittery party hats sat at angles on everyone's heads, including the adults who wore them with the kind of dignified silliness that only family celebrations could inspire. George's cardboard countdown clock held place of honor on the mantelpiece, its handmade hands pointing toward their approaching celebration. "Ladies and gentlemen," James announced with mock formality, "welcome to the first annual Middleton Wales New Year's Eve extravaganza." He gestured grandly toward their transformed space, earning applause from his audience. The evening began with parlor games that brought out everyone's competitive spirit. They played charades, with Louis's attempts at acting out Elephant becoming an instant family legend. His interpretation involved crawling on all fours while making what he assured everyone were authentic elephant sounds, though they bore little resemblance to any wildlife Catherine had ever encountered. William surprised everyone by revealing a talent for drawing during their game of Pictionary. His sketch of a castle was so detailed that George accused him of showing off, while Charlotte demanded he teach her how to draw turrets with such precision. Watching him completely absorbed in the silly competition, Catherine was reminded of the university student she had fallen in love with, competitive, funny, and wonderfully unself-conscious. "Your turn, Daddy," Charlotte announced, presenting William with a folded paper containing his next charades challenge. William opened the paper, read it, and immediately began laughing. "This is impossible," he protested. "No excuses. George declared with the authority of someone who had successfully acted out astronaut earlier in the evening. William's attempt to act out royal protocol became a masterpiece of physical comedy. He began with exaggerated bowing, moved through elaborate hand gestures that seemed to involve invisible crowns and scepters, and finished with what appeared to be a complex curtsying sequence. The family watched in delighted confusion until Catherine guessed the answer, earning cheers from everyone and a theatrical bow from William. As the games continued, Catherine noticed how naturally her children interacted with their grandparents and uncle. There were no formal titles or ceremonial distance, just the easy intimacy of family relationships. Louis climbed onto his grandfather's lap without ceremony, Charlotte braided her grandmother's hair while they talked, and George engaged James in serious discussions about photography techniques. Dinner was announced by Carol's gentle ringing of an old silver bell that had called the family to meals for decades. The dining room table had been set with mismatched china that told the story of years of family gatherings, some pieces inherited from grandparents, others collected during travels, all of them carrying memories and meaning that no royal porcelain could match. The meal itself was a celebration of comfort food elevated by love and attention. Carol had prepared all of Catherine's childhood favorites: shepherd's pie with perfectly browned potato topping, roasted vegetables from their own garden, Yorkshire puddings that rose to impressive heights, and a chocolate trifle that had been the centerpiece of family celebrations for as long as Catherine could remember. "This is better than any restaurant," William declared, savoring a bite of the shepherd's pie. "That's because it's made with love," Louis announced seriously, earning knowing smiles from the adults. The dinner conversation flowed as naturally as wine, touching on memories and plans, current events and family gossip. Michael shared stories from his latest business ventures, while Carol updated them on news from old family friends. James described his recent photography exhibition and his plans for traveling to document conservation efforts in Scotland. Catherine found herself studying her children throughout the meal, amazed by how different they seemed in this environment. Without the constant awareness of being observed and photographed, they were more animated, more genuinely themselves. George told elaborate stories about his school friends, complete with voices and gestures that had everyone laughing. Charlotte sang a song she had learned in music class, her clear voice filling the room with pure joy. "Mummy," Charlotte said during a brief pause in the conversation, "can we have dinner like this at our house sometimes? Just us, without any other people?" Catherine felt her heart contract at the innocent question that revealed so much about their usual family life. How often did they sit down together without staff present, without official guests, without the formality that governed their royal existence? "I'd like that very much," Catherine said softly, catching William's eye across the table. She saw her own thoughts reflected in his expression, the realization of what their children were missing, and the determination to change it. As dinner wound down, the excitement began building toward their midnight celebration. The children had been allowed to stay up far past their usual bedtime, and the novelty of this special privilege added to their enthusiasm. George checked their homemade countdown clock frequently, announcing the remaining hours with increasing excitement. The family moved back to the sitting room for what James had designated the pre-midnight entertainment program. This involved more games, the sharing of New Year's resolutions, and the consumption of Carol's famous hot chocolate with marshmallows that melted into perfect swirls of sweetness. "What's your resolution, Granny?" Charlotte asked, snuggled next to Carol on the sofa. "To spend more time with my grandchildren," Carol replied without hesitation, earning enthusiastic approval from all three children. "What about you, Grandpa?" George asked. "To teach my grandson everything I know about beekeeping," Michael answered solemnly, assuming he's brave enough to learn. "I'm very brave," George assured him with the confidence that only 8-year-old boys possess. When it was William's turn, he was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "I want to be more present," he said finally. "To pay attention to the moments that really matter, like this one." Catherine's resolution came easily. "I want to remember that the best celebrations aren't the grandest ones, but the ones filled with the people you love most." The children's resolutions were wonderfully practical and ambitious. George wanted to learn to ride his bicycle without training wheels and to read every book in his school library. Charlotte resolved to become the best cookie baker in her family and to teach Louis how to tie his shoes. Louis, not entirely understanding the concept but eager to participate, announced that he wanted to grow tall enough to reach the cookies on the high shelf without help. As the evening progressed toward midnight, the atmosphere grew more magical. James had dimmed the lights and lit candles around the room, creating shadows that danced on the walls. The children's excitement was infectious, and even the adults found themselves caught up in the anticipation of the approaching new year. At 11:30, they moved outside to the cottage garden, bundled in coats and scarves, to watch for fireworks in the distance. The night was clear and cold, perfect for stargazing and listening for the sounds of celebration from neighboring villages. Louis sat on William's shoulders, scanning the horizon for signs of distant pyrotechnics, while Charlotte and George took turns with Michael's binoculars. "Look!" Charlotte suddenly pointed to the eastern sky where a single firework bloomed like a flower against the darkness. The family stood together in the garden, watching occasional bursts of light appear in the distance, listening to the muffled sounds of other celebrations, and feeling the profound connection that comes from sharing a perfect moment with people you love completely. As the final minutes of the year ticked away, Catherine realized that this simple celebration had given them something precious that no formal royal event ever could: the gift of being completely themselves, surrounded by unconditional love, marking the passage of time in the most natural and meaningful way possible. As the final minutes of the old year slipped away, the family huddled together in the cottage garden, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp winter air. George had taken charge of the countdown using his homemade cardboard clock, while Charlotte clutched the noisemakers she had crafted earlier with intense concentration. Louis, perched high on William's shoulders, had the best view of any fireworks that might appear in the distance. 5 minutes. George announced with the authority of someone entrusted with an important responsibility. The anticipation was electric, but different from the formal countdowns they usually experienced at official events. Here, there were no television cameras, no choreographed celebrations, no expectations beyond the simple joy of welcoming a new year together as a family. Catherine found herself holding her breath, not from nerves about public performance, but from the pure happiness of the moment. Michael had brought out a bottle of champagne that had been saving for a special occasion, along with sparkling apple cider for the children. The glasses were mismatched, some crystal inherited from great-aunts, others simple tumblers from the kitchen, but they caught the starlight beautifully as Carol carefully poured drinks for everyone. "To family," Michael said, raising his glass in an impromptu toast before the official countdown began. "To being together," Carol added, her eyes bright with emotion. "To the best New Year's Eve ever," Charlotte declared with the confidence of someone who had experienced the ultimate celebration. As the seconds ticked away, Catherine felt William's arm tighten around her waist. She leaned into his warmth, watching their children's faces glow with excitement in the soft light from the cottage windows. This moment felt more precious than any state function, more meaningful than any official celebration they had ever attended. 10. George shouted, beginning the final countdown. 9. The family joined in, their voices creating a joyful chorus that echoed across the quiet countryside. 8. Louis's voice rose above the others, his excitement making him bounce on his father's shoulders. 7. Catherine looked around at the faces of the people she loved most, memorizing every detail of this perfect moment. 6. William caught her eye and smiled, the same smile that had captured her heart during their university days. 5. Carol and Michael stood with their arms around each other, their faces reflecting years of shared celebrations and continuing love. 4. James raised his camera to capture the moment, then lowered it again, choosing to experience rather than document. 3. Charlotte grabbed her grandmother's hand, bouncing with excitement. 2. The anticipation reached its peak, everyone holding their breath for the magical transition. 1. Happy New Year, the family shouted together, their voices carrying across the winter landscape. Fireworks erupted in the distance at exactly midnight, as if the universe had coordinated the celebration specifically for them. The children cheered and applauded, while the adults embraced and exchanged kisses. Louis threw his arms around William's neck, Charlotte hugged everyone she could reach, and George declared it the best countdown in the history of New Year's celebrations. The champagne and cider were consumed with toasts and laughter, while more fireworks painted the sky with brief bursts of color. The family stood together in the garden for long minutes, reluctant to break the spell of the moment, watching the sky and listening to distant celebrations from neighboring villages. Eventually, the cold drove them back inside, where the warmth of the cottage welcomed them with the lingering sense of their celebration dinner and the soft glow of candles. The children were giddy with the excitement of having stayed up until midnight, chattering about everything they had seen and experienced. "Can we do this every year?" George asked as they settled back into the sitting room. Every single year, William promised without hesitation, and Catherine felt her heart swell at the certainty in his voice. The next hour was spent in the gentle decompression that follows perfect celebrations. The children gradually succumbed to the tiredness that their excitement had been holding at bay. Louis fell asleep in his grandfather's lap, his small body completely relaxed in the way that only completely secure children can manage. Charlotte curled up next to Catherine on the sofa, fighting sleep but eventually surrendering to the peaceful atmosphere. George, determined to prove his maturity by staying awake longest, engaged James in quiet conversation about the photographs he had taken during their celebration. But even he eventually nodded off in his chair by the fire, his head tilting to one side as sleep claimed him. The adults spent a few more quiet hours together, talking softly about the evening, sharing memories of other New Year's celebrations, and planning future gatherings. There was no rush to end the night, no schedule demanding their attention, no official duties waiting for the morning. "This has been perfect," William said quietly, his voice heavy with contentment and, perhaps a touch of emotion. "Different from what we usually do," Catherine replied, unconsciously echoing their conversation from the previous evening. "Better," William said again, even more firmly than before. As the first light of the new year began to creep across the horizon, the family finally admitted that sleep was necessary. The children were carried to their beds, still wearing their party hats and clutching their homemade noisemakers. Catherine and William tucked them in with gentle kisses and whispered promises of more adventures in the morning. Standing in the hallway outside their children's rooms, Catherine and William paused to look back at the sitting room, still decorated with their homemade party materials, still glowing with the warmth of their celebration. "I don't want this feeling to end," Catherine whispered. "It doesn't have to," William replied, pulling her close. "We can choose this. We can choose family and authenticity and moments like tonight." Catherine nodded against his shoulder, feeling the truth of his words settle in her heart. They had spent years believing that their royal duties required them to sacrifice personal happiness, that service meant giving up the simple pleasures that other families took for granted. But tonight had proven that the opposite was true. They served best when they were most genuinely themselves, most connected to the values and relationships that made them whole. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the first day of a new year that felt full of possibility. The family gathered for breakfast in the same spirit of easy intimacy that had characterized their entire visit. There were homemade pancakes again, fresh fruit, and coffee that tasted better because it was shared with people who loved them completely. The children were eager to share their favorite moments from the previous evening, retelling stories that had happened just hours earlier with the enthusiasm of people recounting great adventures. Louis insisted that his grandfather's shepherd's pie was the best food in the entire world. Charlotte announced plans to teach her school friends how to make the party hats they had created. George declared his intention to learn more about photography so he could document their next family celebration. As they prepared to return to their official lives, Catherine felt different. The weight of royal responsibility hadn't disappeared, but it felt more manageable, balanced by the renewed understanding of what truly mattered. Their duties would continue, their public service would remain important, but they would never again forget that their greatest success lay in being authentic parents, partners, and family members. The drive back to Adelaide Cottage was quieter than their arrival had been, filled with the comfortable tiredness that follows perfect experiences. The children dozed in the back seat, exhausted from their late night but utterly content. Catherine and William drove in peaceful silence, both processing the significance of what they had experienced. "Thank you," William said as they turned into their own driveway. "For what?" Catherine asked. "For suggesting this. For reminding me what matters most. For giving our children something they'll remember forever." Catherine smiled, watching their home come into view. Adelaide Cottage looked different somehow, more welcoming, as if their experience at her parents' house had changed her perspective on what made a place feel like home. The new year stretched ahead of them, full of official duties and royal responsibilities. But now they faced it with renewed understanding of who they were beneath the titles and ceremony. They were parents who would make time for family dinners. They were partners who would choose authenticity over protocol whenever possible. They were people who understood that the most important celebrations happen not in grand ballrooms, but in kitchens filled with laughter and love. As they helped their sleepy children out of the car and into their own home, Catherine realized that this was just the beginning. The new year would bring many changes, but the most important one had already begun: the choice to prioritize the relationships and experiences that made them most fully themselves. The cottage in Bucklebury would always be there, ready to welcome them back whenever they needed reminding of what truly mattered. But, more importantly, they now carried that feeling with them wherever they went, the knowledge that the best celebrations, the most meaningful moments, and the deepest happiness came not from grand gestures or public recognition, but from the simple act of being together with the people who loved them exactly as they were. Their New Year's Eve with the Middletons had given them something more valuable than any crown jewel. It had given them back themselves, and each other, in the most fundamental and beautiful way possible.